Ren Faire is a new docuseries created by HBO Max, which follows the battle for ownership for the largest Renaissance fair in the United States. And it's got just about everything you could possibly want. Drama, music, love, betrayal, crazy old men, and kettle corn. But what I really found fascinating is the way that this documentary ends up telling stories about stories. In its own very unique way, Ren Faire welcomes us into a world where stories are reality, where humans can be heroes or villains, and it warns us of the catastrophic consequences of trying to turn reality into fiction. If you haven't gotten around to watching Ren Faire yet, I highly recommend it. It's just 3 hour-long episodes, it's streaming on Max right now, and although I was admittedly pretty skeptical going into it, it won me over. The show opens by asking the question, what is a king without his kingdom? What is a king without his property? They conclude that he's free. From there, they take us on a wild tour of the kingdom in question, the Texas Renaissance Festival. The Texas Renaissance Festival, or the TRF, was founded in 1974, and since then it has become the most attended Renaissance festival in the country. It's got performers, vendors, food, drink, parties, and shows, all clad in the dressings of old-timey Europe. Speaking of parties, my neighbors seem to be having one right now, so if you hear boisterous male voices in the background, please consider that ambiance, because we're talking about Renaissance festivals. There are people who have been working at the TRF since its founding, people who live there all year round, for whom the Texas Renaissance Festival is their living and their life. This has all been made possible because of the efforts of one man, George Colum, who they call King George. He first had the idea for the TRF when he attended a Renaissance fair in San Francisco, but he took that seed of an idea and expanded it to an almost unimaginable scope and scale. He even had to incorporate his own town to support the festival's efforts, a town where he is, of course, mayor. King George has always been the beating heart, the lord of the land, and most of his employees are acutely aware of his importance.
He's the ruler.
He's not crazy. He's just thinking on a level that you can't comprehend.
Some of his employees seem to view him as godlike. They call him immortal. Of course, the documentary then immediately deflates this reputation by introducing us to King George, a man who could not be any more mortal. He's in his 80s, and he has a firm plan to die in 9 years exactly, when he turns 95. He wakes up to the sound of Enya's music because one of his assistants has hit play on the CD, and that will continue to play through most of the rest of the day, and he begins his mornings by hypnotizing himself into not having any epileptic seizures. The very best business advice that he can give to us, the audience, is to subscribe to the Doll magazine, where he gets all of his costume ideas from. He lives on a sprawling property where the decor captures Rococo, Art Nouveau, and Ren Faire cheesiness in the most eye-bleeding way possible. He has a nurse that monitors his health every day, a chauffeur that drives him every single place he goes, and of course a personal assistant to run his 15 sugar daddy dating profiles. Eccentric doesn't really do the man justice. According to him, all that King George wants with the last 9 years of his life is to sell the festival, spend all of his money, and die in the arms of a younger woman. And since his very romantic dates to the Olive Garden haven't been going so well lately, and he's still looking for his next ostentatious home renovation project, it seems the next item on the list is to sell the festival, or at least to find somebody to run it in his place. And there are 3 main candidates for the throne. First off, we have Jeff Baldwin, who I will lovingly refer to as an adult theater kid. Don't worry, I can say that. I am also a theater kid. He's been at the festival for over 40 years and has worked his way up, starting as a performer, becoming the entertainment director, and now being the general manager. The TRF is his entire life. It's where he met his wife Brandy, it's where they got married, and he thinks of the employees as his children. And the reason he's made it this far is because of his absolutely undying loyalty to King George. Jeff believes that his decades of ring kissing and humble service make him the perfect candidate for the throne. He's the one that King George trusts, the one he knows will always serve him, so who better to take over the fair? Unfortunately, if Jeff was to have a fatal flaw, it would probably be that he doesn't really know how to run a serious business. On the business side of things, we find our next potential heir, Louis Migliaccio, the entrepreneur. He started out at the festival making and selling kettle corn, but he has since expanded his business ventures to include rentable rickshaws, medieval-themed Dippin' Dots, and more. Louis seems to get by slamming up to 14 energy drinks a day, and has big dreams of introducing EDM parties and steampunk shows to the festival. With over 100 employees already working under him at the TRF, and the work ethic to haul the festival into the 21st century, Louis seems like he might be the perfect candidate. He also, importantly, has nearly enough money to just buy King George out of the festival entirely. The only one who can really match Louis when it comes to business expertise is Darla Smith, the elephant trainer. Darla started out her career training elephants for Ren Fairs, and she has used those skills that she learned, communicating with powerful and illiterate creatures, to rise to a position of trust and power in the Ren Fair business. But despite the fact that she works at Ren Fairs, it doesn't seem like she's in it for the fame, the drama, or the fairy tale. She prefers to work behind the scenes, so much so that she's barely in the first episode of the show. Of course, it's this outside perspective, this keen sense for business, that makes her so interesting to watch when the spotlight does eventually swing her way. With a clear head and an incredibly competent understanding of the politics at play in this situation, why would King George choose anyone but Darla? All of the candidates have their pros and their cons, their shticks and their stories, their own legitimate reasons for why they should have the throne, but with King George making the choice, things were bound to get messy. Jeff starts out desperately trying to win favor by submitting further and further to the king's whims. He wants to hire his highly qualified and loyal wife to the position of entertainment director, a role that she's practically been working in for years now, but because King George says no because he thinks that's nepotism, Jeff immediately backs down and lets his wife down. He puts on the guise of excitement when King George sends him out of the country for a business trip, even when he knows that every year before this, these trips have ended in the general manager losing their job. And this time is no different. At the end of episode 1, Jeff's assistant calls him to inform him that Louis is going to be buying the festival, and Jeff might be out a job. Then again, just as that deal materializes, as King George says it's gonna work, it's gonna be a good deal, it collapses because he decides that it's not enough money. But even with the appearance of Louis being defeated, it's not like Jeff's in the clear. Citing mismanagement of the fair, King George removes Darla from her former role as vendor coordinator and makes her co-general manager with Jeff. Jeff tries desperately to prove himself, even as co-general manager, to scrabble his way back into King George's good graces, but pretty soon he is fired completely. He has spent over 40 years completely devoting his life to the TRF. He's been King George's most loyal servant, and just like that, he's completely let go because, in George's words, "You piss me off." As Jeff flounders, trying to find a new life for himself, Darla is pulled into the eye of the storm. From here, King George alternates between taking women on Olive Garden dates to see if their breasts are real, and psychologically torturing Darla during business meetings. His requests are becoming more and more irrational and unreasonable, as he demands that she instantly gathers all of the Faire's assets, while also buying more land, while also reading a book every time she uses the bathroom because apparently she doesn't read enough. Still, he seems set on the idea of selling the Fair, but since Louis's out of the picture, he's gonna be selling it to one of the vendors. Darla works overtime to get this deal together to be able to extract the king from the Fair, but then at the very last minute before it all goes through, he pulls out of the deal and it's all been for naught. Jeff sends a frankly quite pitiful email to King George, basically pleading with him to give him back his old job of entertainment director, and he's hired back to that role with very little fanfare or even an acknowledgement or an apology from King George. By the end of the show, by episode 3, we're right back in some familiar territory. Jeff is groveling in the hopes of winning favor, Louis is trying to put together another deal to buy the festival this time, and Darla is just trying to keep the ship afloat. You might not be surprised to learn that the end credits tell us that Louis's new deal also collapsed, Darla was fired, and George had elected himself to be general manager. As if to mock the painfully cyclical nature of this show, it closes on the same line where it began, asking, what is a king without his kingdom? This time, there's no hopeful message about how then the king would be free. It ends, and nothing has changed. But to me, what elevates Ren Faire, what keeps it from just being a Succession knockoff, is the fact that this is a documentary. We're not really watching King George, the lord of the festival and the firm king of all of his subjects and lands. We're just watching an 80-year-old guy named George. And here is where the real intrigue of this show lies, in that permeable little place between reality and fiction, in that thin line between people and the characters that they pretend to be. The best way to show this off was to have the audience take in the story through the eyes of Jeff. Although, arguably, everybody in the show has a flair for the dramatic, Jeff just can't seem to keep himself from seeing the world as a story. He literally introduces himself to the show by saying that he is the Oompa Loompa to George's Willy Wonka. He later brings up a play that he was in called Daddy's Dyin' Who's Got the Will in order to explain his personal connection to events. On multiple occasions, he calls George King Lear. These comparisons to stories seem to be a way to help him cope. It helps him make sense of the chaos of the world that he's in. But when you look a little deeper at these comparisons, you see how misguided and frankly flawed they really are. King Lear is a play by William Shakespeare that follows the dissolution of the kingdom once lorded over by King Lear. Lear was once all-powerful, godlike, but in his age he's become frail and weak, prone to fits of passion and rage. But he knows that death is coming, and that he will have to divide up his kingdom, and the play opens on him making that decision. Lear has 3 daughters, and his original plan was to divide the land up equally between them. First, though, he has to test them, to see how much they love him. His 2 eldest daughters take up this challenge with gusto, claiming that he is everything to them, that they love him more than any other man in the world, even their husbands. His youngest and formerly favorite daughter, Cordelia, though, she has other plans. She truly and actually loves her father. She loves him too much to lie. Unhappy that I am, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty according to my bond, no more nor less. You have begot me, bred me, loved me. I return those duties back as are right fit, obey you, love you, and most honor you. Her refusal to offer blind flattery sends Lear into a rage. Cordelia, once the favorite daughter, is banished and disowned, sent away in utter and complete shame. But now, without his kingship, without his power, or even his loving daughter, Lear finds himself alone. His remaining daughters, despite their pretty words, say that now they just see him as a fool. They've lost all respect for him. Lear is driven completely mad by this sudden change in station, and although he is reunited with Cordelia, in the end they're both killed. The two eldest daughters are also killed by their own treachery, and the great throne of Britain ends up in the hands of someone who is not an heir of Lear at all. Now, in premise alone, I absolutely see why Jeff made this comparison. He sees George as a Lear figure, once great, but now wilted by age and forced to give up his power. Jeff even takes it a step forward, calling himself Cordelia, the one faithful child. It seems sort of like those stories line up, but as soon as you take a closer look at it, the comparison falls apart. You see, Jeff isn't really a Cordelia. Cordelia is loyal, yes, but she also will not surrender to Lear's desire for vain flattery. She will not appease him if it means keeping him from the truth. In Ren Faire, though, Jeff has no problems heaping on the praise. He is banished by the king, he does get fired, but that's not because he stood up to King George. It's because the king was pissed off and just didn't want him around anymore. Cordelia leaves in shame, but she certainly doesn't send an email to King Lear begging to be brought back in a lower station. But at its heart, the King Lear-Ren Faire comparison falls apart because George is not King Lear. We meet King Lear at the end of his journey. He is surrendering power, and the crux of his tragedy is watching a once great man grasp for the control that he once had. But there's not a single moment in Ren Faire where George does not have all the power. Anyone that believed otherwise, anyone that believed that at any point he would willingly hand over control of the Renfest, they weren't thinking clearly. In the very beginning, in the first episode, one of his long-term employees says of George, "A lot of people have come in thinking they could take it over, but never been successful. He sees it as a game." I think that Jeff was contextualizing the events of Ren Faire as Willy Wonka, as Daddy's Dying Who's Got the Will, as King Lear, because in all of those stories, the patriarch, the owner, the king, was truly on his way out. The world works as it should, the crown being passed down from the old patriarch to the new worthy heir. But unfortunately, real life is very rarely that orderly. Despite having all the trappings of age, of madness, of soon surrendering power, from the very first episode, George has no plans of allowing anything to change. From the very beginning to the very end, he is pulling every single string. Sure, he says that he wants to retire, that he wants to find a pretty lady and sit back and make art for the next 9 years, but he is far too savagely afraid of trusting anyone. At one point, George tells the tale of his mother and father, and of how he believes his mother completely dominated his father in family affairs. This has trickled down into George to become a belief that anybody and everyone has it out for him. They want to take his power and leave him with nothing, and if he doesn't want that to happen, he has to fight back. He explains seeing it as,
when they get their knife out and cut my balls off, I have a reaction.
There will be no elegant transition of power in Ren Faire. There will be no inheritance duly earned, no new owner of the chocolate factory, not even the tragic ending that we see in King Lear. Instead, the tragedy lies in the fact that in George's world, nothing ever changes. The documentary's director, Lance Oppenheim, describes it as a cycle. That cycle is something that every single person in Colum's past has gone through so many times, says Oppenheim. The only way he would return to the TRF to film more episodes, he tells me, is if that cycle is broken and Colum loses power of the festival. For now, they're just trapped in this endless loop. hamsters spinning in their little wheels for George's amusement. When they had a showing of the first episode of Ren Faire for George, despite how borderline insane he comes across in that first episode, apparently he loved it. He even mouthed along to some of his speeches word for word. This just goes to show that even some of the unscripted parts of the documentary, at least for George, they were still scripted. Really though, I think everyone in that show was performing a bit. At first, this was a challenging aspect of the show for me to tackle. The first episode has a very peculiar way of mixing what we would typically consider real documentary footage and clearly scripted and staged scenes. The last, 5 minutes of episode 1 is this extended fever dream sequence as Jeff dramatically staggers around a European Renfest, pursued by the glowing green grin of Louis as he cackles about owning the festival. Watching this was hard because the people weren't acting like people, they were acting like characters. Jeff was the perfect picture of the theater kid gone adult. Louis was the ridiculously caffeine-addicted entrepreneur, Darla the cold, hard businesswoman, and King George, the comically evil overlord. If these are real people, as the documentary title implies, why on earth would they subject themselves to the caricaturization and humiliation of a show like this? I found it, frankly, unbelievable. But it had captured my attention enough to keep watching it, and as I got to the second and third episode, a realization dawned on me. These are real people, they're just theater people. Of course Jeff would willingly sit down in front of a camera and tearfully sing through an entire ballad from Shrek. I do that all the time. Of course Louis would be willing to ham it up for a fever dream sequence. They already showed him dubbing over 70s pop songs with lyrics about kettle corn. Of course King George would ramble on about how much he hates women who've gotten plastic surgery and his new Rococo style bathroom and how much he hates nepotism. There just are people like that. There absolutely are people who would be willing to turn themselves into caricatures if it meant telling a good story. That's why Darla is probably my favorite part of this whole show. She has been on the fringes of this wild theatrical world long enough to know how these people are, but she's just not really up for hamming it up in front of the camera like the guys are. And honestly, so much of her frustration seems to stem from the fact that no matter what, these guys will not let go of the characters they're playing. Jeff and Louis can't seem to accept the fact that they are playing right into George's game, and George will not stop playing the game. And that is what is so perfect about all of this taking place at a Renaissance fair. In terms of types of performance, Ren Fairs are very unique. They blend real life and fiction, real speech and fantasy accents, a real place and a fantasy realm, until it can be kind of hard to tell what's fictional and what's not. The boundary between fiction and reality is very easily lost. Someone like Jeff, who wants everything to be Shakespeare, who wants everyone to play their correct parts, is nearly broken when reality rears its ugly head and the masks come off to reveal messy, real, complicated people. Ren Faire isn't just a story, it is about stories, and the way that sometimes we invent stories and pretend they're real when in fact they are not. If we allow ourselves to get too lost, too swept away by the unreal, we risk becoming Georges ourselves. Too absorbed in the story that we tell ourselves that we die never knowing who we really are. Now, it ought to be noted that I have been talking throughout this video about these people as if they are characters. And honestly, I don't think that's wrong of me to do. I think they do turn them into characters for the sake of the documentary. But aside from being characters, everybody in this show is a real person, and nothing that I say in this video should be taken as an actual commentary on themselves, their morals. I'm not psychoanalyzing them. I don't know these people. They are more multifaceted, nuanced, and human than any one documentary could ever capture, and I truly do admire and appreciate the way that they so fully threw themselves into creating this piece of art. I also want to mention that while I did enjoy this show, it doesn't do the best job at representing all Renaissance fairs. Now, that's not to be taken as a critique. They were trying to tell a story, and they did a good job of telling that story. But if this is your first exposure to Renaissance fairs as a concept, I highly recommend that you go and do your own research. I didn't say this just to be a plug for my videos, but I did do a video about the history of the Renaissance fair, and I will link that above and in the description if you want to check that out. And if you ever get the chance to attend a Renaissance fair, I highly, highly recommend it. Just remember that leaping into fantasy and blurring the line between fiction and reality a bit is not a bad thing. You just have to be mindful that the real world is beautiful too, and if you're too busy trying to fit it into the neat mold of the story you want to tell, you're gonna miss what makes it so incredible. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and if you have watched the show, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. This show's been pretty divisive on the internet as far as I can tell, but I just thought it was such an incredible use of the documentary format, and I would love to see more from this team. If you haven't subscribed, consider doing that, because I put out videos almost every single week about the stuff that I like to talk about, and I would love to have you join. Thank you so much for hanging out with me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.